Hi, welcome. My name is Jamie. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in Christian counseling of substance abuse and addictive disorders. I was a licensed addiction counselor in the state of Arizona for a few years before having a midlife crisis and realizing I wanted to write full time, and I have somehow stumbled into the TikTok creator life. So here we are, still very passionate about mental health issues, addiction issues. We'll be talking about that a lot more. So every Tuesday night, I also host a Let's Talk Mental Health live, and I will be back to hosting that tomorrow at 6 p.m. Mountain Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Jamie, I'm your host, and I want to guide you through conversations that don't always fit neatly into boxes. This is a space for honesty, nuance, and real life experiences around mental health and emotional well-being. I'm a mental health advocate still to this day, and I am extremely passionate about breaking stigma, creating room for conversations that are often uncomfortable, and normalizing the discussion about mental health. I like to share from my lived experience, reflection, and just years of observation. I always joke and say mental illness doesn't run in my family. It stops to say hello to everyone, make sure we all get acquainted with it. I've had many years of experience around mental health prior to becoming a mental health professional and now an advocate. I am not a licensed therapist anymore or a mental health professional. This discussion is not a substitute for therapy, medical care, or professional mental health treatment. And everything I share reflects my own experiences, my own opinions, and my own understanding. However, if you are struggling, please reach out to a qualified professional who can support you appropriately. And before we go any further, I want to make sure that I let you guys know that in the US, you can call or text 988 to reach the crisis line, and you can also text hello to 741-741 to reach the crisis line. You are not weak if you need help, and you are not alone. So first thing we're going to talk about is understanding grief. Today we're going to talk about understanding grief, specifically the lie that grief is supposed to be linear. Grief is a little bit of a roller coaster, right? Nobody grieves and just gets over it. I always like to think of grief as like losing an arm or a leg. Just learn to adapt to not having that body part. I think it's the same way with grief. You just learn to get used to that loss. When most people hear the word grief, they immediately think of death. And yeah, death is definitely a profound and devastating loss. I'm not even going to minimize that at all. But grief is so much bigger than that. But grief is so much more than just the loss of life. Grief can come from loss of a relationship, a divorce, an estrangement, losing a job, career identity, a decline in your health, infertility, addiction recovery, and the loss of safety, normalcy, or who you thought you'd be. And I think that these are things that are not discussed enough when we talk about grief. We have a lot of grief support groups when you lose somebody, but you don't always have the support you need for the other types of grief that you experience. Grief is what happens when reality no longer matches your expectations. And the stages of grief is a little controversial. Some consider it a myth. Some consider it a solid understanding. I think it really just depends on where you find things that you fit into the grief model. Most of us were taught that there's 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think that those can actually apply to more than just grief. But I also think that those stages come from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, and this is what often gets lost, is they were never meant to be linear, universal, or prescriptive, meaning it's not going to be the same for everybody because we all grieve differently. Some people skip right to the anger, some people skip right to bargaining, some people, and then sometimes you go back and forth. Like I know when I lost my father, I went from denial to anger to bargaining to anger to bargaining to depression to anger. And it actually took me a long, long time to get into the acceptance stage. It was not easy. So essentially, I guess what I'm saying is grief does not neatly move from one place to the next, especially when you think about the 5 stages of grief. And it doesn't move neatly from point A to point B. Essentially, it loops like I just described. It can backtrack, it can pause. You might finally hit acceptance, and then out of nowhere, it ambushes you in the grocery store when a certain song comes on, or a certain smell hits, or you see somebody who reminds you of the person that you lost. You can feel acceptance and be angry at the same time. You can feel fine for weeks or even years, and then flattened by grief on a random Tuesday. There's no line up or down. It's literally a roller coaster. I keep doing that with my hand, huh? That's not a failure. That's grief. That's what grief looks like. We never get over our loss. I think that we never get over any of those losses. Some of those losses are just as debilitating to you as losing somebody. Especially if you have like a career that you love and you lose it, right? So it's not failure. You're not a failure just because you experience grief. It's being human. Me, grief did not show up politely. It did not announce itself, and it sure as fuck didn't follow any rules. Some days I was able to function. Other days I couldn't answer a text or a phone call or even get out of bed. And the hardest part was feeling like I was doing everything wrong. Like I was doing grief wrong, like I wasn't grieving properly, because everyone else seemed to expect me to progress and get closure on a timeline that maybe existed for them but didn't exist for me. And it's devastating. And I think that especially when I've talked about this before, like sometimes you're grieving somebody who's still alive, but you have to keep your distance because you have to protect your peace. And I think you can go through exactly everything I just described, even with a living person. So yeah, I feel like your timeline might not be what other people expect from you, but who cares? You grieve in your own way. That doesn't mean do nothing but grieve. And I don't think I'm really going to touch on that today, but it does mean that sometimes it's going to take longer than other people expect, and that's all you can do is hope that you take it day by day and that you can get through it, right? Because unfortunately with grief also, in order to come to terms with it, we have to go through it. And we never talk about how happy we are when we're happy, right? Not the same way we do when we're going through something. Sometimes we get really stuck in grief mode, and that's all we can think about is our grief, right? We have a hard time reflecting on happy times or good times. But when we're in good times, we often don't go, oh, I miss my grief. But when we're grieving, we might miss our joy. So grief is very, very complicated in that way. The intersection of grief and mental health is something I also think gets overlooked a little bit, because there does come a point where something is no longer grief. It is maybe long-term depression. Grief doesn't exist in isolation, and it does directly impact your mental health, whether it's briefly or whether it takes longer or whether it's lifelong. I know, like for me, I've had lifelong depression. Losing somebody made my depression worse. Even big changes are things that I have grieved before, because it was overwhelming to me. Grief can trigger depression and anxiety. Grief can trigger depression or anxiety. It can intensify PTSD. It can disrupt your sleep. It can disrupt your appetite, and it can disrupt your focus. And when we talk about appetite, you might not eat enough or you might overeat. I tend to fall on the overeat spectrum, but sometimes I'm on the I don't eat enough spectrum. It can also lower your emotional resilience, meaning, you know how like they talk about the straw that broke the camel's back? One thing could become the proverbial straw, meaning you might break down over something little. And thinking back to a few years ago, I was dealing with a lot. I was taking care of my grandmother. I had just decided that I was going to write full time. It was a lot of changes all at once. And all of a sudden it just hit me, and I couldn't find the fucking remote for the goddamn TV. And I broke down and I started throwing shit and getting angry. And then I just broke down and cried. And I'll never forget, like, my husband came in and he hugged me and he was like, "It's not the remote you're mad at." And it wasn't the remote that I'm mad at, but it was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. So I feel like we've all been there to some degree. And that's also one of those things that makes grief complicated. Grief and depression can also look similar, but they're not the same. Grief tends to come in waves. Depression often feels more constant and pervasive. Grief and depression can look similar, but they're not the same. Grief tends to come in waves. Depression often feels more constant and pervasive. So grief will hit and then you'll be okay. It'll hit again and then you'll be okay. Depression can sometimes function just getting up and getting out of bed, which is something we can sometimes do in grief. We'll have like little bursts of energy. Depression, maybe we don't feel that energy at all. Complicated grief is sometimes called prolonged grief, and it happens when loss becomes stuck. And what I mean by stuck, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's something that like overwhelms your daily functioning long term, which I think I kind of explained already. But this is not, I'm not trying to label anything or diagnose anything, but it is about understanding when support is needed, because you need support when you're grieving, but you also need support when you're struggling with depression. Sometimes you have that support right after somebody passes or you lose something or everything's going wrong. Sometimes you don't have that support when you're struggling with depression. And I think part of it is because depression is still stigmatized. People see it as you're being lazy. You just don't want to get out of bed. You don't want to have to do anything. You're malingering. You're just using the grief to not go to work or function or as an excuse or whatever. Because, I mean, let's be honest, the world's a little bit cruel. We've got a lot of a-holes out there. That's where I think people don't understand the difference between depression and grief. People accept when somebody's grieving. They're not as receptive when somebody's struggling with depression. And they can be very similar. They can be related, and one can be brought on by the other. You're going to have exhaustion. You're going to have brain fog. You're going to have body aches, sleep disturbances, appetite changes. Very similar to depression, but sometimes we mask enough with depression that you may not know somebody's even struggling with it. I don't know how many times I've met somebody and then one day I find out they have been depressed for months, and I'm like, I never would have known. Your nervous system is under such stress that like you can't even think. And I think about my mom. When my father passed away, they had a car. It was really weird. They had bought this particular kind of insurance on the car because they knew that he was going to be getting knee surgery and would be out of work. So they got this thing, this disability insurance that would make the car payment while he was out of work. What they didn't know was this also covered if he was to pass away while they still owed on this car. So they bought this life insurance, and when he passed away, it paid off the car. But my mom had to go and do something with the title after, it was paid off. And when she went to the DMV to do it, it was a whole mess because they were like, he has to be here. And she was like, you want me to prop his dead body up and bring him in? Like, I don't know what else to do. But then she was so flustered by all of that. We finally got it worked out, right? She was so flustered by all of that. She set all of her stuff on the car, and we got in the car, and she was going to drive off with it in the car. I'm like, Mom, your stuff is still on the hood of the car. That's the brain fog. That's the brain fog. And brain fog, not brain frog. But you also hear in there was the anger, right? Like, she was already depressed because my father passed, but then you have the anger. So we have the stages of grief, but then we have the brain fog. So that's what makes grief so complicated. And if you already live with anxiety, depression, trauma, grief can amplify everything. I feel like grief can make you, it's like depression on steroids, honestly. And it's not a personal failure. It's just your system is responding to that overload. And grief can be isolating, especially when others feel like you should have moved on, had closure, be in the acceptance stage, or if they're uncomfortable with your pain. You know how sometimes like men can't be around women who cry because it's too much for their brain? That can also happen with grief, where people are just like, I don't know what else to do. We don't always know how to communicate that we're just happy if you can sit with us and support us during our grief, right? I think you can have grief from health issues. Yeah, I think you can. And the reason I say that, I'm thinking about somebody I know who, they're disabled now. Extremely disabled. And they weren't before, but something happened that caused debilitating injury to the point where they're grieving the life they don't have anymore because they can't hold down a job. They can't do any of those things that they used to do. So I think you can grieve health issues. I also think you can grieve health issues because it can make you feel kind of stuck in a way where you maybe are dependent on benefits, right? Like Social Security or whatever, and you want to do something to make a little extra money and you can't because then it affects your livelihood, and that extra money might not even be consistent or something like that. So I think that I definitely think grief can play a role in that for sure. And the loneliness can be just as painful as the grief itself, especially, and I think to your question, especially if you've had a change in your life, like a job loss due to health or disabling conditions, because people who do not live with you or live outside of your home, might not understand that you can't just get up and go to work anymore. You would love to get up and go to work, but you can't. It's not an option, right? So I think to your question, definitely can be a little bit isolating because at first you have all this support, right? Especially if you have an injury or a loss. But then eventually that support goes away and it's just you, and you have to figure out how to pick up the pieces to your life without that support. Now, I want to challenge some misconceptions about grief, and this is probably something that you can relate to. Most people can relate to this, I think. And that is, you should be over it by now. There is no expiration date on loss. There's no expiration date on loss. Time heals all wounds. And these are cliches that we've all heard, right? Time alone does not heal. Time alone does not heal. And the reason I say that is because we can be 10 years from a loss and still break down like that loss was yesterday. I know that, like, for myself, the further I get from it, the easier it is for me to live life. But that doesn't mean that I don't still feel sadness and depression in spurts related to that grief. Time alone doesn't heal. Support, processing, and meaningful things do. Stay strong. Stay strong. Strength doesn't mean suppression, and it doesn't mean silence. Strength is what you're building while you're going through the grief process. It's not just as easy as stay strong. Like, grief can break a person. It can break a person. Everyone grieves differently. That is true, but that does not mean that all grief is understood. And I think this ties into all grief is not supported equally, right? All grief is not supported equally. Disenfranchised grief. Some grief is not socially validated. Estranged relationships, miscarriages, loss of identity, which can tie into loss of job or, a change in your ability to work or your capabilities. Just because society does not acknowledge these things does not mean they don't count. Non-death losses, addiction-related losses, these can be things that people just don't see on the same level as my grandma died or my child died. Some people just don't see it the same, and it's not really fair. It's not really fair, and I think this is why I'm having these conversations, because we really need to put more thought into our intentions in what we say and what we do. In order to change other people's thinking, we have to model it through our own behaviors. So coping with grief while protecting mental health. Permission to feel. You need to give yourself permission to feel. You are allowed to feel everything. You are allowed to feel everything. Your feelings are valid. Do not let anybody tell you they're not. Numbness, rage, relief, sadness, confusion, anxiety, anger, depression, irritability. You are allowed to feel those things. Now, that's not an excuse to be an asshole, but you are allowed to feel those things. You are allowed to feel those things. And suppressing your grief is not going to make it disappear. It makes it louder. And I can speak to this from experience. I walked around angry for 10 years. 10 years I walked around angry. Angry at the world. Angry I lost my father. I didn't understand. I did not understand that I was dealing not only with PTSD, but I had never properly grieved. I had never properly grieved. Because I was so busy taking care of my mom and having kids and taking care of my children. I didn't want to lose my baby. I never properly grieved. And it took me, and this is going to sound crazy, okay? When I finally realized why I was so angry and that I had never grieved and that I was dealing with PTSD that was not diagnosed, I had to put in the movie Forrest Gump. Because I had been holding on to that grief so long, it changed the way I grieve. I cannot cry when somebody passes away. I want to cry, but I held it in for so long, it's like it became part of me. So in order to grieve, I actually had to watch the movie Forrest Gump. And you know the part where he goes to Jenny's grave and he's like, Jenny, and it makes me cry every time. And that's what I have to do still to this day. If I need to cry, I have to watch a tearjerker because otherwise it doesn't come out. That's how badly I misunderstood grieving and how holding on to it actually makes it worse. So, and I do try now to allow myself to feel whatever I feel, but there are times where I still struggle with the physical parts of grief, crying, emotions, etc. Now, I'm going to talk about practical coping strategies, but I just want to be very clear. You cannot fix grief, okay? And you cannot heal from grief overnight. The same way you can't fix depression or heal from depression overnight, okay? So there are tools that you can use to process through those emotions, to try and get through those emotions. Journaling, expressive writing, rituals, memorials, movement, exercise, walking, going to the gym, yoga, whatever movement looks like for you. Creative expression. And this is where I have to say, like, I don't write the same now as I did when I was angry, pissed off, and grieving. And sometimes it frustrates me because I'm like, I can't write that deep emotional shit. So I will say that I'm my most creative when I'm struggling with grief, but I do not want any more grief. We do not need any more grief. No more grief, please. No more grief. But creative expression is a great way to heal. Some people like to draw, some people like to color, paint, make videos, craft, whatever it is for you. Spending time in nature, and I think spending time in nature is just good for your health overall. I won't go off on that tangent, but spending time in nature, there's something about it that it just makes you see. I don't know if it's the oxygen, the good oxygen going to your brain when you're up in the mountains or on a hiking trail, or if it's just the beauty of everything. But I definitely think nature helps. And I know, like, putting my feet in the sand at the beach, oh my God, that's my shit. Even though I hate coming home with sand and everything, okay? Putting my feet, I remember I went to Florida a few years ago, and it was like November and the weather was so nice. I was able to get in the ocean, okay? Because I'm like a child if you take me to the beach. And I was running. I don't run, okay? And I was 40 pounds heavier than I am right now. But I was so excited to be at the beach, my ass was running on the beach. And so I can't tell you what it is. I don't know if it's the ocean waves. I don't know if it's the sand, the texture of the sand on my feet. But I love it. But I also like to hike. I just huff and puff the entire way. The power of connection. You don't need a crowd to feel connected when you're grieving. You just need safe people or a safe person, safe place, safe, whatever it is that looks like for you. Support groups, grief circles, online communities, places where your pain doesn't make others uncomfortable. And this is where I think support groups are like awesome, because there's so many people, like, I don't know how many times, okay, Jamie used to hate groups. I'm just going to say that. I used to hate groups. Then I went to school to be a therapist, and then I understood the purpose it served. And I started doing better when I would be in a group, whether it's a community support, whatever. Where was I going with that thought? People can relate to your experiences. And I don't know how many times I've been sitting somewhere and going like, oh my God, I'm not alone with this problem, whether it's chronic pain, trauma, veterans issues, mommy issues. Like support groups can be wonderful for that. Whether they're formal, informal, paid, unpaid, doesn't matter. Just find you a group. I think that's why like the 12 steps is such a big thing in recovery. I personally am not a fan of the 12 steps, but I believe in all paths to recovery. So if it works for you, do it. But I think that's why. I think it's the element of being around people who can understand and relate to the things that you've been through. When you need to seek professional help with grief, if your grief is preventing daily function, if it is accompanied by persistent hopelessness, and I mean hopelessness, like every day you're just like, oh, I'm going to get through the day. Like nothing's good, nothing. Your negative thoughts outweigh your positive thoughts. If it starts leading to thoughts of self-harm, or if it's intensifying your existing mental health symptoms to a point where you may end up in crisis, then you need to seek help. I believe in preventative care. I think a lot of us know our cues before we go into crisis. And we don't always listen to them because we don't have time or we don't want to, or people maybe aren't supportive. But I do think that if you know it's going to put you into crisis, it is okay to seek help before the crisis occurs. You don't have to wait till the crisis occurs. That is not weakness. Asking for help is not weakness. That is compassion for yourself. Okay? Self-compassion is something that you have to try to have, but it's a struggle when you're grieving or when you're depressed. Grief is not a productivity project. You have to be gentle with yourself. You have to accept that you are dealing with something or that you are carrying something heavy. You can't just be like, oh, there's something wrong with me because blah, 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 right? Grief doesn't end. It integrates. You don't move on. You don't get over it. You learn to adapt to it. You learn to move with it. Grief becomes part of your story. It doesn't become your entire story. It becomes part of your story. But I also think it becomes part of your strength. Because I think some of the most amazing people in this world are people who have been after issue, trauma after trauma, loss after loss. I feel like those are some of our smartest people because they've had to navigate in some of the shittiest situations. Loss itself doesn't happen for a reason, but humans like to find meaning in things. So we rebuild purpose slowly and imperfectly. Sometimes we don't know what our purpose is, or sometimes we lose sight of our purpose because of grief. Growth does not cancel pain. Both can exist. Growth does not cancel pain, meaning just because you've learned to start living your life without waking up and crying every day does not mean that you forgot about that thing that you loved, or that person that you loved, or that change that was created for you. Both pain and growth can exist. They can coexist. You can honor loss. I know I have a friend who she honors the loss of her nephew every year in November. I don't know if it was his birthday or when he passed away, but every year she does a barbecue and they ride on balloons and they make it like a big thing, and that's how they honor their loss. Everybody has a thing. I'm at a place in my life where it's been 22 years since my father passed away. I don't go to his grave anymore. He wouldn't want that. He wouldn't want that. He wouldn't want me going to talk to his grave anymore. He would want me to be working on me and focusing on me and focusing on growth. That doesn't mean I don't think about him. That doesn't mean that I don't have a picture of him in my living room. That doesn't mean I don't still talk to him. I just don't have to go to his grave anymore. I also sometimes don't even acknowledge that it's the anniversary of his death anymore, because I want to think about how he lived in life, not that he's gone. And I can do that every day. I don't have to wait for one day a year. We all do it differently, though. There's no wrong way to honor your loss. Okay, so I just want to be clear about that. You can talk about memories. You can talk about rituals. You can talk about storytelling. You can talk, I love to tell the story of where my dad had just had knee surgery, got on an ATV and ran into a barbed wire fence, shredded up his clothes, and his brother was like, your wife is going to kick your ass. Like, I still love telling that story because it's hilarious. It's hilarious because I'll never forget. He opened the front door, and I guess the seat of his pants was ripped, right? And he opened the front door, and he's like, go get your mom. So I go and get my mom, and he's like, go to your room. Well, of course I'm not going to my room. Now I want to know what the fuck's going on. I'm nosy. And then we saw his clothes, and he was like, I ran into a barbed wire fence. And, then we started calling him Shredder, and we thought it was hilarious, And I love telling that story because it makes me laugh. And he would laugh about it. He laughed about it afterwards. It just, in that moment, he was angry that we were nosy. Grief is going to resurface. So I'm going to tie that honor your loss into the waves of grief, okay? Grief is going to resurface at times. Anniversaries, smells, certain songs. Whenever I hear Eric Clapton, Wonderful Tonight, that's all I think about because my dad played guitar and he used to play that song. And that does not mean that you're back at square one with grief. I like to think of those as like a flare up. It's a flare up. All of a sudden my grief just flared up. Tomorrow it might be different. You think of it however you want, however you feel is best for you. I like to think of it as a flare up. Oh my God, today's going to be that day where I'm not going to be able to function because I'm struggling with my grief today. It does help to stay busy, but staying busy to avoid it is not going to make it go away. It's just going to be more persistent. Okay? You have permission to feel joy. You have permission to feel happy. You have permission to feel joy. Okay? Joy, happiness, those are not a betrayal because you lost somebody. You have a right to still have joy. You're still here. You're still here. You are allowed to feel joy. Now, if you feel joy the first day, police might come looking at you. But if you are a couple weeks down the road and you start getting your groove back, there's nothing wrong with that. Laughter is not disrespectful. It is okay to laugh. Laughter is so healing. It's so healing. I love to watch a good comedian. I love to watch a good comedian. Living your life happy does not erase your loss. You are not betraying somebody because you are trying to move on from your grief. You're moving on from your grief. You're not moving on from your loss. And I just have a few closing thoughts before we wrap up the live, okay? And it's really more of just like a recap of everything I've talked about today, and that is grief is not linear. There is no correct timeline for grief. There is no expiration date for grief. Mental health and grief are deeply connected. You are allowed to ask for help. You are allowed to need support. You are allowed to not be okay. You are allowed to not be okay. If you're grieving, you are not broken. You are responding to loss. You are responding to loss. If you are in the acceptance stage, or you are months, weeks, years removed from your grief and you are living your life, you do not have to feel guilt or shame because you've moved on. Because you moved on with your life, you didn't move on from your loss. Okay? If you're in the US and you find yourself in crisis, whether now or in the future, you can now dial 988. You don't even have to remember that big fancy number, okay? Thank you for sitting here with me today and trusting me with this conversation. And thank you for being here with me. I appreciate you. If this resonates with you, please share your thoughts. Share your thoughts. Okay? Until next time, I want you to be gentle with yourself. You guys all have a wonderful Monday, and thanks for being here.